So, welcome everyone, and in particular, a warm welcome to Sharon Parker. Sharon Parker is today's speaker, and she's an ARC laureate and fellow. She's also a John Curtin Distinguished Professor at Curtin University and the director of the Center for Transformative Work Design at Curtin University, as well as a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Science and a fellow of the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology. So she fits very well into our program and the research topics we are working on, and it's a great pleasure to have her here. She's also the recipient of the Kathleen Fitzpatrick Award, the Academy of Management OB Division Mentoring Award, and in November 2019, she received that one. Sharon was also named among the world's most influential scientists and social scientists in the Web of Science group in 2019 list. She's a highly cited researcher in general, and the only female in Australia appearing on this list in the field of economics and business, I believe also in 2019. She has published more than 150 international refereed articles, including publications in top journals such as the Journal of Applied Psychology, the AMJ, the Academy of Management Review, and the Annual Review of Psychology. And her research topics include, among others, work design, proactive behavior, job performance, and she has been an associate editor for the Academy of Management Annals and has provided or has previously served on numerous editorial boards. She has also received a lot of third-party grants and funding, I think, worth over 40 million USD. And she has worked with a wide range of public and private organizations, I believe, probably with field experiments and a lot of field studies. So this is very, very interesting. And we are very much looking forward to your talk, which will be today about the digital agenda, a smart work design perspective. So thank you very much for being with us, and we are very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Lars, for inviting me. It's a wonder of modern technology that I can do so, whilst sitting in my own lounge room here in Perth, Western Australia. So as Lars mentioned, I'm going to give a quite broad overview of some of the research that we've been doing on this topic, but more than happy to drill down a little bit deeper into specific topics if people have questions as we go. So I'm just trying to move forward on my slides and it's not letting me for some reason. Oh, here we go. That's better. So I did just want to tell you a little bit about our centre, first of all. So I'm the director of the Centre for Transformative Work Design. So we have been going for about 3.5 years now. And we're really focusing very much on this topic of work design, which funnily enough has been a very well-established topic, but has become quite popular in recent years, partly because of mental health issues at work and partly also because of the future of work agenda. But a little bit about our centre. We try to do world-class research. So we look at all sorts of different topics. We've been doing work on entrepreneurship and work design, for example. We've been looking at how work design affects brain functioning. We're even looking at work design, and I'll talk about this study a bit later in the context of automated trains. But we also very much try to also focus on impact. So we do have a group of people, mostly organizational psychologists, whose job it is to try to help us get our work out into the world. And we find that that's a good synergy because we are encouraging people in practice to use evidence, and the legitimacy and the expertise that comes from doing the research, helps with that take up. So we've actually been doing a lot of very practical things in recent times, particularly around mental health. So we have the smart work design model, which I'll talk about today, but we also have a lot of work on Thrive at Work, which is our mental health initiative. And we also have various other practical things that we do. And of course, one of the things we hope is that that practical work that we do feeds back into our research, both in terms of money and research opportunities, but also just in trying to help us keep our research relevant to the real world. So I did just want to take that little moment to tell you a little bit about us, because we have, for example, a visiting scheme where we, pre-COVID, used to have researchers come from Europe and the US, early career researchers, and you know, and spend a bit of time with us and collaborate and so on. We still do run that visiting scheme, so if anyone is interested, do let me know. So the future of work, there's just been obviously a huge amount of conversation about it, and I won't go into much depth here, but you all know there's the sort of negative, pessimistic perspective on the digital agenda, with sort of these extreme ideas of takeover of the world, etc. But even if they're not those extreme takeover the world ideas, you know, there is a lot of conversation in the media about mass unemployment. There are real legitimate concerns about more polarization and inequity occurring because of the digital agenda, and also new psychosocial risks or stress factors in the workplace. On the other side of the coin, you know, we have that more utopian version, and, you know, some economists that you would be familiar with predicted, you know, this leisure society into the future. And again, whether or not we'll see, you know, that sort of extreme version of utopia, we don't know. But what we do know is that we are definitely seeing new jobs, new opportunities, certainly some people getting more interesting work. And one always has this hope that we might get some more leisure one time. So those are those contrasting perspectives. But in fact, of course, the reality is we're going to lie somewhere in between. And partly we're going to lie somewhere in between because of this Gartner hype cycle that I'm sure you're all familiar with, you know, which talks about how we get these new technologies and there's this sort of amazing utopian expectations about how they're going to transform everything and be amazing. And then we enter that trough of disillusionment when we discover that, you know, I don't know, 3D printing isn't what we thought it was going to be or whatever. And then gradually over time, this slope of enlightenment emerges where we start to figure out how to properly use and embed this technology, and we get to that higher productivity. So that's one reason why we get these sort of extreme perspectives, because we have those peaks and troughs around experience. But another reason, of course, is work design. And what I'm talking about here is all of the arguments in the you know, that really recognize that it's not so much whole jobs that are likely to disappear, but in fact, it's about the tasks in the jobs that are going to be automated. So I think some predictions, 60% of 30% of jobs are going to have 60% of those tasks will be automated. And of course, as soon as we, you know, enter into that sort of perspective, you know, we really move into that territory of work design, because when we recognize that so much of our work will be in interface with technology, we have to ask questions about how are we organizing that work and what is the content of the work. And that's the sort of fundamental perspective of work design, the content and organizing of tasks, activities, relationships and responsibilities within a job or role, or a task, a set of jobs or roles, such as a team. And actually, increasingly, I think we're even asking that question about task characteristics. I know, for example, Lars, you're interested in crowdsourcing, and this, you know, often people are just doing tasks, really, not necessarily whole jobs. So that's what work design is. It's been around a long time, but it's sometimes been hard for people to come to grips with work design because there's just so many different work design elements that have been focused on. So we created the smart work design model, and we created really mostly for practice, because we wanted to help practitioners, managers and so on come to grips with this topic. But it is based on a higher order factor analysis of work characteristics, and that is under review and hopefully going to be published soon. So our higher order factor analysis of multiple aspects of work design, and you can see some of them across the top, identified these 5 aspects, sort of higher order categories or meta categories of work design. The first one being stimulating, so work having some variety, using your skills, being meaningful, having some complexity, having some information to process. The second one being mastery, and this is really recognizing that most people want to go to work and do a good job. So they need to know what it is that they're doing. So they need that role clarity. They also need to get feedback on how they're performing. And it really helps people to know what it is they're meant to be doing. If they are, the more that they're doing a whole job, or the more that they understand where their job fits into that bigger picture. The third is agency, and we mean here human agency, although there's been a lot talked about now around the autonomy of machines. Here we're talking about the agency of humans. In terms of people's control over work timing, and I guess that's been a big one during COVID, in that people, if you're working from home, often have a bit more flexibility around when you work. Also important is control over your work methods, or having some agency over how you work, and just generally being involved in decision making. The fourth aspect of the model is relational, and this really is reflecting the fact that all human beings have a fundamental need to connect with other human beings. Again, something we've really learnt during COVID. And so aspects from a work perspective that are important are things like having the opportunity to connect, have social contact, the opportunity to connect with the end user or the people that benefit from the work, getting support, social support from peers and supervisors, and being part of a team. And then last one, often the big one, certainly the big one in many Australian organisations, is the importance of having demands that are tolerable. And the idea here is that all work has demands. That's pretty much the definition of work. We've got things we've got to do. It might be emotional demands, might be cognitive, might be physical. But those demands need to be experienced as psychologically tolerable. Otherwise, they are very stress-inducing. And so that's the smart work design in a model in a nutshell. And I just want to show you it here. We did one of the things that we did to try to convey work design was sketch people when they were working, and then we interviewed them about their work and mapped it onto the model. So these are some hospital supply workers whose job it is to take supplies to wards and so on. And you can see here they're talking about things that would fit in the stimulation category. There's never a dull moment. I like the variety, or they change the wards that we work with, so we get to know different people. Mastery, this person says they're learning, so they're developing skills. Agency, we can influence how we do things, so we've got a bit of control. Relational, you can see this is quite a big element. Them talking about we help each other, our group works well together, but also having that relational connection to the people who benefit from the work. It helps the patients who come to the hospital. And then tolerable, actually here they're starting to talk about maybe their demands getting less tolerable. Things have got harder, the hospitals got bigger, and so on. So that's the model. And I just want to share very briefly that some examples of some recent research around work design. I'll come to the future work agenda just after this. But first of all, there's a huge amount of evidence that those aspects of work influence mental health and also physical health. And just as one example, just published a study with a colleague, Nick Turner, where we showed actually the link between, in particular, it says human resource management practices, but we showed in particular the importance of agency, or the importance of people having autonomy, and that resulted in fewer injury rates. That was a large scale study. Work design is also important for your motivation and your engagement. And just to give another example, Bin Wang and myself and some other colleagues we did a study. This study actually was conducted in China very early in COVID, where we looked at remote working and we used a work design perspective. And we showed how even while people were working remotely, those smart aspects were very important in shaping people's motivation and hence their performance and stress during COVID. Work design is also important for learning. And because I said before that work design is about the opportunity to develop skills and so on, but even aspects like autonomy can actually promote learning and development. And actually just finished a paper that's just been published in the Academy Management Annals called Can High Quality Jobs Help Workers Learn New Tricks? And here what we do is we actually review a whole lot of literature from multiple disciplines where we look at the relationship between the quality of work or the work design and learning and even cognitive outcomes like cognitive functioning. And there is some evidence, for example, that if people have been in careers that have got smart aspects, so challenging, interesting careers, but with autonomy and support, they're actually more likely to maintain their cognitive functioning as they age. So that's an example of a study on that dimension. And then just the last one there, because of all those things that I just mentioned, because smart work can make you more motivated and can promote learning and so on, it's not surprising to expect that when work is well designed that we would see performance benefits. And there is an example there of a systematic review of work redesign interventions that we published recently that showed that most of the studies that have investigated this have found that work redesign to make work in essence smarter actually does improve performance. So there's a wealth of evidence there. Actually, in a sort of review of 100 years of research on this topic, we found there were more than, actually that should say 5,000, not 500, more than 5,000 articles on work design. So the question though that we'll focus on today is this one: what's the impact of digital technologies on smart work design? So the idea here is if we can understand the impact of technology on work design, then we can also understand how to make sure that digital technologies don't harm people in the workplace and that they also foster that learning and motivation and performance that I mentioned as important. So that's the question: how do digital technologies affect smart work? So let's go first to stimulating, and this is about work having variety and challenge and so on. And there are, for each of these aspects of work design, I'll talk about the opportunities, but also some of the risks. And then later I'll talk about, you know, some of the factors that influence which direction it goes. Obviously, there's huge opportunities for digitalization and AI and so on to make work more interesting. And we see that because of that notion that the dull, routine work, the dirty work, the dangerous work can be replaced, leaving the more complex work. And some research that I'm conducting with some colleagues in Lithuania actually showed this is pretty much what happened. They introduced industrial robots, and the cognitive demands of the job have increased. And the humans, the manufacturing people are actually, engaging in really quite complex, increasingly complex work, and feeling still strong sense of meaning and so on in their work. Of course, though, we can also see digitalization going in the opposite direction and creating, for example, more passive monitoring jobs. So here are the sorts of jobs where, because of automation, the model is sort of, let's automate their job, and then the human's job is to just sort of watch and check that it's all working. And that sort of monitoring job can be incredibly boring. because basically the role is to sit there and monitor the situation until something goes wrong. And we are seeing more of those sorts of jobs emerging. We do see changes in roles, sometimes with less work to do, and I'll give some examples in a minute. And we do see things like online piecework or micro work emerging, enabled by digitalization. Just to give one example of changes in roles, this is robotic surgery, and that quote there is by a scrub nurse, and you can see them standing around the table. And they talked about how when the robotic surgery was introduced, their roles were changed, and their roles really were basically became set up the instruments at the beginning and then clean them up at the end. And as you can see there, the scrub nurse is saying, well, we didn't really have any other role beyond that. So that's a clear case where the work design has changed for the negative. Another example, been working with a colleague on some automated train driving in Western Australia. And there has been really a huge impact on the work becoming less stimulating. So lots of things have happened, and you can see some of the things there, but the train drivers have gone from in that area, it was considered quite high status, high prestige job, very strong identity around being a train driver. Train drivers feeling very proud of hauling these huge trucks, you know, across the desert. But then really now becoming more like technicians, feeling that they're not using their problem-solving skills, feeling that some of the tasks they were expected to do instead, like cleaning the trains, just didn't really have any meaning, and not really using their skills, and so on and so forth. And you can see that quote there down the bottom, which actually that one of the operators said, you know, we're the Band-Aid, you know, and until the techies get here to fit things. So really feeling like their job is just sort of patch up things when they go wrong. So that's an example really of where automation has occurred, but there hasn't necessarily been that proactive attention to, well, what are we going to do with the people whose jobs are being automated? What about mastery? So remember, mastery is about being clear about what it is that you're doing and getting feedback and so on. And certainly, you know, sensors, for example, you know, huge amount of data being collected now. All these are great opportunities to give people more information and also more data, you know, that they can use to master their work. But we also see as well, the converse, some risks. And one of the big ones is the area that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, of how, depending on how the work is designed, people can actually end up with less learning, less skill development, because they become out of the loop. So they're not getting the feedback that they need to keep their skills up and to learn. And I just want to give an example. There's obviously lots of examples in aviation that you're probably familiar with, but one example that's come out of surgery is a really nice example. And this was a close analysis of, again, the robotic surgery, but looking at how people learn to become surgeons. And if you think about how people normally learn to become surgeons, you know, you have that sort of master apprentice type model. Surgeon starts it off, gets it going, maybe does a few of the hard bits, and then often will call in the trainee resident and sort of just leave them to it, and they just really get stuck in and have a go. But the way the digital technology has really changed the learning opportunities for the residents, and that's partly because the digital technologies are designed around efficiency. So they're designed to maximize the amount of time that the expensive surgeon is, you know, able to directly do the surgery, which is great from an efficiency perspective, but it's not so good from a learning perspective for the trainee. And so in this study, they observed that learning was reduced because the trainee had fewer opportunities to actually do the surgery, because the system is designed to maximize that expensive surgeon to do the surgery. They felt very peripheral, I guess, with the surgeon having the main role. Other issues were things like, because you can see that screen there in that picture, you can see that when the trainee resident is doing the surgery, if they do make a mistake, it's very visible for everyone. The errors are, in a sense, magnified, and the supervision is a lot closer. So, you know, all these sorts of challenges led to this chair in urology concluding, well, these residents, they trained in the top programs that teach robotic surgery, and they suck. I mean, these guys can't do it. They haven't any experience doing it. They watched it happen. Watching a movie doesn't make you an actor, you know what I'm saying. And I've actually had conversations now with quite a few people, even in areas like law, where one of the ways that lawyers learn is doing a lot of that routine work that's now being automated. So there is increasingly this question of how do people get that knowledge and skill being automated, but you still need the knowledge and skill if you are to be an effective lawyer or an effective surgeon. So this is a risk, I think, in the future that we need to be looking out for. What about agency? Well, once again, a lot more data, a lot more information flow. There's lots of opportunities to actually increase human agency because people can be given the knowledge that they need to make decisions and to be more autonomous. But then we also have that tension that's emerging between agency of the human and agency of the machine or the algorithms. And we are seeing more and more questions asked around the replacement of human judgment with decision-making by algorithms. And this book, I'm not sure if you've read it, but it's a really lovely analysis actually of how algorithms were used pre-financial crisis and in a sense contributed to the financial crisis because they were great at dealing with the situation when it stays the same. But when the situation's volatile and changes, as you know, algorithms don't perform so well because they're based on historical data. And so they're not really designed for those new situations. And, you know, I think another way in which agency can be reduced is because some of these systems actually do to take away human agency. So myself and Xavier Perron-Rochelot there, we just actually finished a systematic review of algorithmic management and asked that question, what's the impact of algorithmic management on work design? And algorithmic management, as you would know, is, you know, the classic domain is Uber drivers and those sorts of gig types of jobs, but we're actually seeing algorithmic management spread into other areas. And in our review, we found that most of the studies that were reported actually showed negative effects on autonomy and also actually some other negative effects. But, you know, but then there's this argument, well, you know, actually people have, if we take, let's take the classic Uber driver, well, people have got autonomy. They could choose which rides they take and which rides they don't take. But, you know, actually when you look into this into a little bit more detail, it turns out that the algorithms take into account what you decline, and then that can affect people depending on how they're configured. But in these studies, it can then affect people's subsequent performance assessment, and that can affect what rides they're allocated in the future. And so the apparent autonomy that the Uber driver has actually is not really as autonomous as it appears. And obviously this big discussion around, you know, either you're an employer or self-employed, and, you know, this trade-off between autonomy and not, and whether you're an employer, this is obviously a big discussion, a big legal discussion in Australia, and I know it is around the world. But certainly our review suggests that most applications of algorithmic management, at least that are published, tend to reduce human agency. Relational aspects of work, which is, this is about teamwork and connection and contact with other people. And obviously there's huge opportunities that come from humans and machines or AI working together. And that's that concept of a centaur team being more effective, and lots of anecdotal evidence around that, you know, that one chess player with a mediocre computer, for example, can beat, you know, a world champion chess player because of that combination, that centaur team that they and the technology enable. But again, we see risks. Obviously, we've seen that with COVID, in the sense of we did some research on work design during COVID, and remote work, many benefits, but obviously the isolation and the connection has been a major challenge for many people. We also see other sorts of risks when you work together with a robot in a team. That two things can happen. One is that you cannot trust the technology enough and then neglect it. And we've seen that in our own research. In hospitals, for example, we've seen multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment sitting in the corner, basically getting dust on them because the doctors don't trust that they actually could put a patient in there and they'd be okay. But you also see the other side of the coin, which is when people trust too much in the technology. And this results in this concept of automation surprises, which is when you know, you sort of switched off, zoned out, and then something happens and you've lost your situational awareness and you don't know what's going on. And suddenly you've got to fly the plane, in the case of that example that I've given there. As I mentioned before, you know, quite a few analyses in the aviation industry suggesting that, you know, you can lose some knowledge and situational awareness if you rely too much on automation. And in a nutshell, you can sort of forget how to fly, which is fine 99.9% of the time, but that 0.1% when you need to be able to fly can create some problems. And then, of course, if we go to demands, the whole point of technology really is to make things easier, and certainly it is reducing physical demands, and I think we're seeing that it's also reducing some of the more cognitive demands in some work, but we're also seeing that increased intensification. So sometimes technology being implemented or designed in such a way, you know, that, for example, it enables, it results in sort of electronic tethering. And actually we reported that phenomenon happening during COVID. And what that meant really was that in some senses, some managers didn't trust their workers. And so they would actually just check up on them all the time, or actually surveillance cameras, the number of surveillance cameras sold during COVID increased dramatically because people came up with monitoring solutions to check that their workers were working. So we do see also those risks, which of course can actually increase demands. And the classic example is Amazon fulfillment centers, where technology, people wear these they have these wristband things that monitor people's movement and have been sort of really designed to keep people working constantly with very few breaks. And all around the world, actually, there've been a lot of analysis suggesting that the work of these people is incredibly intense, and that's been very much enabled by technology. So if we go back to that question, you know, does digital technology, does it make work smart? Does it make work less smart? And of course, what we're really suggesting here is really a contingent sort of perspective, in that we're saying, well, it can really go either way. And partly it depends on how have those roles been designed, and have they been designed with human work in mind? And has there been any real attention to the work design of the workers? So if I go back now to this example I gave before, where the nurse's role was really vastly reduced, actually, when you read the paper, what happened in this scenario was that there was that one of the surgeons was sort of struggling, and so asked a nurse to jump in and actually help move the instruments around on the table, as in do some of the surgery. And it turned out that the nurse was really good at that. And then because of that sort of accident, they then changed the role and allowed nurses to actually help with the surgery per se, and basically improve the nurse's role. So that's a great outcome, but that was a sort of happy accident. And my point is that we could be thinking about this sort of thing before the technology is introduced. And currently we often don't do that. I guess another example is the train study that I mentioned. We've been invited in to try and improve the design of those train worker jobs, but we weren't invited in before that everything was automated. We were invited in after, when the workers were very alienated, and they were having real difficulties attracting people still to do the job. So being proactive and thinking about it, and the goal should be about augmenting human work, not merely replacing human work. And that's sort of obvious to us social scientists, but we work a lot with technologists, and often the emphasis of the technology is on replacing people. It's not about saying what's the goal of the work and let's see how we can help humans to do it. The emphasis is on how do we eradicate humans from the system. If we adopt that more augmentation approach, then we think that there can be much better outcomes. And I just give the example there of, this is a geneticist that we worked with, and you can see the study that we've published there, where they introduced this thing called patient archive, which is where, you know, sort of, it's like a, you know, it's like a big decision-making thing, which got all data from all around the world on these rare diseases. And the geneticists can use that patient archive to try and diagnose rare diseases. But what you hear them saying, and what you hear the lead in the group saying, is that that patient archive is just one opinion out of many. So it's not that the patient archive has replaced human decision-making, but the patient archive contributes to human decision-making. And that's a really important distinction, because it means that the expertise of the geneticist is still vitally important. And actually what that study there is about is our analysis. We showed, we analysed the introduction of the patient archive, but also a teamwork system into this hospital context. And there were really fantastic outcomes in terms of many of these rare diseases that hadn't been diagnosed for 20 years suddenly got diagnosed. And really we tried to understand why. What was it about this change that enabled these rare diseases to be diagnosed? And mostly it was in the teamwork. And what we found from our interviews and our analyses was that for the first time, all these different specialists were coming together, and one of them would say, oh, well, I've got this sort of idea, and another one go, oh, well, yeah, I sort of had that idea. And through teamwork, they converged on a diagnosis. And the patient archive helped, but it was really the teamwork that was so critical. So I think that's just a nice example of, we still need the human worker. And then I think here's another example of that same point, that actually, analyses are suggesting that if you want to get the benefits of the technology, you have to create better work to really get those benefits. So this is an analysis from that book that's mentioned there at the bottom that sort of identified who's actually ready for digital technologies. And the ones that were mature, sort of closer to being ready, are the ones that are actually giving more agency to humans. Because if you want to maximize the value of technology for flexibility and innovation and those sorts of things, you need humans that have also got agency, and that's where you get the real power of the technology. Just the last point that I'd like to make is it's also what we're trying to do more now in our own work is go back to the source of where the technology is designed. So working with the people that design and commission technology to think about the work beforehand. Because as I've mentioned in a few examples, often that's not what happens. Often you think about the work when it's actually implemented into the work system. But actually, can we be creating better technologies? This happens with personal technology all the time. If you think of our iPhones and stuff, there's so much human-centered design because the technologists are directly wanting us consumers to buy that. But when it's a work system, it's sold to the commissioners of the technology, and it's sold on the basis of efficiency usually. It's not necessarily sold on the basis of whether it's going to be technology that's actually going to, you know, have good quality work design and help people do their work. So in that spirit, one of the projects we've been working on, actually that's the wrong reference there, sorry. We actually do have a paper, if anyone's interested, where we've been doing some sort of socio-technical systems analysis with people introducing new submarines. So that these are submarines for 20 years time, but they're having to redesign aspects now, and we're working with them to get them to be proactively thinking about, well, how are people actually going to work on these submarines in the future, and what does that mean for the design of the technology and the other systems. The other thing we need to do, and again, this is a project we're keen to work on, is, you know, is understand the mindset of designers and the commissioners of technology. I mentioned before that sometimes the mindset is, you know, mostly about replacing humans and saving money that way. I think there's scope to understand those mindsets and change them. And a classic example is Elon Musk talking about how, you know, having attempted to create this completely automated factory and discovering it was a disaster, you know, has identified that humans are underrated and that actually you still need, you know, humans. So the overall model that we're really arguing for here, and it's articulated in the Parker and Grote paper that I've mentioned there, is that if we want to create healthy work where people are learning and engaged, we need to think about their work design. And if we want these technologies to create good, to have the opportunities, not the risks that I highlighted before, we need to think about the choices that are being made, the active human-centered choices when the technology is being implemented. But we also need to go back downstream and think about the design of the technologies in the first place. And just an example, I mentioned we did a review on algorithmic management. That were sort of recommendations that we made based on others' recommendations, of course, were that if we are going to have algorithmic management systems, and we absolutely are going to, that's already happening, you know, we need to be having some transparency so that Uber drivers, for example, know whether their performance is affected if they decline rides or whatever. We need to make sure that the systems are fairer. If there are harsh judgments from customers that are unreasonable, etc., do the Uber drivers, can they challenge that? Is there a system for doing that that's fair? And then they need to have those more opportunities for influence of the system. Lars, I can see you've got your hand up. Sorry, I don't know how long you've had it up. But do you want to jump in there? Sorry.
No, I think it was right at the beginning, so I do it in the Q&A session. That's fine.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
So I think algorithmic management is just a sort of microcosm example of the point that we're trying to make here, which is, I guess, ultimately about being a bit more proactive up front, downstream, around some of the choices that can be made. It's actually a lot of questions in this area. I think it's a super exciting area of research. You know, how do we maintain human skills and learning when AI is introduced? How do we deal with these risks around over-reliance on automation? When is electronic monitoring good and when is it not so good? There's already a lot of literature around trust in technology, but I think that's always an important topic. How are we going to work alongside robots and machines effectively? And how do we stop people from becoming complacent with automation? And many more. There's obviously many questions to ask. So I just will summarize now my key messages. So I've argued that in general, in all sorts of contexts, work can be more or less smart. So that's stimulating, having mastery, so people having clarity, for example, more or less agentic, having autonomy and agency, more or less relational, so where people feel they can connect with others, and also people can have more or less tolerable demands. And there's a huge amount of evidence that those things affect worker health, well-being, engagement and performance and so on. Digital technologies, as I've argued, can make work less smart or more smart, depending on the nature of the technology itself and also how it's used and implemented. So we should be more proactive in thinking about the work design questions. For example, when introducing new technology, managers and change agents can actually think about those human work roles and make choices and decisions to maximize the smart work design. So the example of the robotic surgery and the nurse, maybe thinking about those roles up front when introducing that technology would be helpful. And then, of course, I've also argued that designers themselves, the engineers, the information technology people, and the commissioners of technology can create and purchase technology that is better for humans and better for work. And as you guys all know, there's a lot more research needed on this topic. So I just conclude with, I painted at the beginning two very different futures, and I can sort of summarize those now from the perspective of what I've talked about. Are we going to have a future which is like the hellish day of an Amazon warehouse employee, where technology is actually being used to really intensify work and put pressure on people and take away control? Or are we going to use technology to augment human performance, like the example of the geneticist who used the patient archive as one source of opinion in making important decisions? And in a sense, I do like to conclude with this quote, which I love, which is that the future is not some place we're going to, but one that we're creating, and the paths are to be found but made. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is some of the ways that we can make a better future of work is through making those active human-centered choices and human-centered design of technology to get that better quality work design. So I think that has brought me pretty much to where I was hoping to get to at this time. More than happy to connect with anyone on LinkedIn. I try to put my papers on there. And also happy to share any of the papers that I've mentioned in the presentation. So that's it from me, Lars. So over to you, I think, for your question, and yeah, any other questions as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sharon. That was a very inspiring talk, and I guess we have a lot of questions. And usually, I have the people from the group ask first. But given that I raised my hand today very early, I think I can go first today.
I think so. First in.
So one thing that, in a sense, a bit surprised me was that when you described your smart work design and these higher order effects, being an economist, I mean, you don't judge me for that. I was surprised that you didn't say anything about payment. And I understand that that's probably not the focus of your research, but in the end, I was thinking, first of all, whether payment doesn't matter for these people, or does it not matter in theory? And then you could say, like, and this is another broader question, people are very different, right? I mean, what you described was more like a supply of labor, like this is how labor can look like. But when I play tennis, there are a couple of tennis players which play very boring tennis. They just play all this in the same way all the time, and they just like it. And I'm wondering whether that's not the same in labor relations, where you could say, well, there are a couple of people, they really like the boring job. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, so two excellent questions. I mean, look, the first thing is to say, payment has just never really been part of work design. That's why it's not in there. It's not to say that it's unimportant, but so work design is more about, what are the tasks that people do and how are they organized and structured, and the choices that you make around that. So payment is a really important thing. So this is not to say that this model captures everything in the world that's important. What we're trying to do is capture the main things that are important from this perspective of work design. So from the perspective of the tasks and how they are organized and what the nature of those tasks is, we're trying to be comprehensive. So absolutely think payment is important, and things like job security come into that too. So those things, so again, really important, but just a little bit beyond the scope of at least what theoretically work design has traditionally focused on. So that's the first question. The second question about people are different, you're absolutely right. And when we do work with organizations, we measure those differences actually. But what I would argue though is that those things, stimulating, mastery, etc., they're actually important for all people. But what is stimulating for one person could be quite different to what's stimulating for another person, as an example. So a colleague that you may well know, Fred Zylstra from the Netherlands, he does some really fantastic research looking at redesigning work to, in a sense, create work for intellectually disabled people, because apparently there's a big agenda in the Netherlands to use more labor. There's labor shortages or something. So, and so actually they do redesign where they take actually some of the demands off. So for example, in hospitals, some of the more routine aspects of the work that just create demands for the professionals, and they allocate those to the intellectually disabled workers. And everybody's happy, because the overburdened nurses, and we all know that nurses and so on, at least in most countries, are quite overburdened with demands. They're happy because some of their demands are taken off them. The intellectually disabled workers are happy because for them, the work that they're doing is stimulating. It's interesting to them. It feels to them that they're using their skills. So I think that's the important part, and that makes it tricky too. We do a lot of work with organizations who say to us, tell me how much workload is okay. Give me a number, is that, well, you can't do it like that, right? You can't say, well, 4 on a 5-point scale is always going to be too much workload, because some people love high workload and thrive on high workload. And some people thrive on high workload one week, but the next week when they're going through a divorce, they don't thrive on high workload. So in the end, there is some interaction with the person always in these judgments that it's impossible to completely take out of the equation. So you're absolutely right. We need to think about people. I would argue that those 5 things are important for pretty much every human on the planet, but what it takes for one person to experience mastery might be different to what another person requires, or one person's tolerance for demands might be somewhat different from another person's. So I hope that makes sense. Possibly a dissatisfying answer to an economist, but psychologists, I think, would understand that. But yes, it's a challenge, right? And that's it's a challenge, and I think we have to put these sorts of things alongside that more objective, work hours and things that we can just measure much more objectively.
Yeah, perfectly understandable. I thought that probably, like, the payment is nowadays, with more technology moving in, also more interwoven with the work design. In a sense, if you think about Uber drivers, or if you think about crowdsourcing, what I'm interested in, right? I mean, it really depends on whether you have a competition or a contest mechanism, or whether you have micro tasks or something like that. It really depends on the design of the platform, how you will be paid in the end. And I guess that makes you more or less happy. Like if you design a logo or something and one person is paid but 10 are not, I guess that probably makes people less happy then, if that's the design. Yeah,
that's a great point. And I actually would conceptually think of that almost as an antecedent of work design. in the sense that the payment system is driving almost a different level of demand for people and so on. But, you know, to some extent, I'm sort of splitting conceptual hairs. You know, from a practical point of view, you are absolutely right that the payment system, the design of it is really integral to the experience that people have in the end. So I think that's really actually a very good point. Yeah.
Okay, so I have asked a lot of questions. I guess there are other people from the group that also have questions. So I think Vera raised her hand.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for your presentation. I really liked it. And we have the one-to-one talk. So, but let me maybe ask one question here in the background. Michelle and I, we are working together with the company, and they have a lot of automation already in their workplaces. It's air traffic control. Mm-hmm. And they are thinking about what they can further automate. How can they speed up, and which kind of automation should they implement in the future, especially which parts or tasks from the air traffic controllers will be automated. And the next step will be the decision-making level. And my question is, do you think that it would be a good idea at all to automate this level, that the automation will decide which plane flights on which altitude, but or do you think the impact on the humans is so high, it's really negative, so that we shouldn't do it at all and never consider it to implement an automation like that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things there. I guess one, you know, and I'm not a technologist, but to some extent, you know, the question might be how, you know, the reality might be that, you know, a bit like car driving and things, that perhaps it's possible to automate all that more safely. If all the systems are lined up and all automated. I think that, but there are lots of challenges though that then come with that need sort of thinking about. And one is the issue of accountability, you know, and we're already having those discussions with you know, driving driverless cars and so on. And this is something Gudala Grote always talks about. It's, you know, currently the idea is that if you have control over, you can't be held accountable for a system unless you have control over it. So if you're in a driverless car, you know, actually, arguably, you can't really be in control of it because you actually lose the situational awareness, like we know with airplane, with pilots and so on. So really, you have to give over the control to the system. But then who's at fault if there's an accident? And, you know, so there's all those discussions around, and that would be huge, I imagine, if you completely automate those systems. Who's accountable? I think there are other challenges also with complete automation. I mean, the reality, as I understand it, is that we can fly planes already without a pilot. It's completely technically feasible. But what human being wants to get onto a plane without a pilot? I mean, would you be happy? So then there are these sort of political sorts of social aspects, I guess, that shape people's responses to things. So look, I can't answer the question of whether it's feasible. I mean, you know, we used to say things like, we'll never have an automated car because the world's too uncertain and unpredictable. And what do we have? We've got an automated car. So, you know, I don't know whether you could completely automate complex systems like that. My guess is that that's where things will go. But the question will more be around, these tricky issues of, can a human override the judgment? When would it make sense for them to do that? When would they have the information to do that? If they can't override this system, or they can't have enough knowledge to do that in a sensible way that they can be held accountable, maybe they shouldn't. Maybe there shouldn't be any humans in the system. So I think those are the sort of questions. But I have to say, this is actually an area of research that we're putting together a centre application that's a big scale funding thing in Australia. So actually one of the questions we have is this designing of complex systems. And I have a colleague that I can connect you with Andrew Neil at the University of Queensland, who's worked with air traffic controllers for many, many years, and he's part of this centre application. And I reckon he could probably give you a much savvier answer than I've just been able to give you. But yes, it's such a good question. These are the sorts of things I think we don't know very well yet.
Thank you.
But one point, I guess the point I'm making is that although we don't know the answer to that question, social scientists, sociologists, psychologists, lawyers, economists need to be part of that question. And I think right now, at the moment, the danger is that the only people addressing that question are the technological designers and not, you know, not us social science type people. So maybe that's the best answer I can give you, that these sorts of professionals need to be part of creating the answers to that question. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, they always discuss also the topic of payment, right? So they say they are really overpaid when the automation is doing the job, right? Then I don't need any more these high-skilled air traffic controllers. That's another topic, and yeah, not easy to discuss in Germany with the employees.
And you know, this is also, you know, one of the challenges with the train drivers, because the job has changed, but you know, it's actually the only unionized part of the company, and so the pay hasn't changed. But that creates some challenges in the system, right? Because there are people who are doing similar jobs now to other people but getting paid more. So this goes back to Lars' point, really, that the payment is quite intricately related to some of these challenges.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, Katharina Klug has one question.
Okay.
Hi,
thank
Katharina.
you. Hi.
How are you? Nice to see you here.
Good. Nice to see you too. I was could disclose that I was actually supposed to visit the center in 2019, and that has been indefinitely postponed for obvious reasons, so that everyone else knows.
We had this wonderful, as I was saying, we had this wonderful visiting scheme. We had 4 visitors, I think, and then they all had to go home because of COVID. And then we had people like Katharina who weren't able to physically come, but hopefully one day. We live in hope.
Yeah. Fingers crossed. Okay, so thank you for the talk. You might have actually already answered my question, or at least in part. I was just thinking, I would 100% agree with your approach that we need a proactive perspective, and we need to involve people with expertise in work design before new technologies are implemented. I was just wondering, because in reality, often problems become obvious when they happen, and how they could have been prevented is something that we know in hindsight. So I was wondering what you think would help us to become better predictors. Is it just a matter of distributing the knowledge that we have and getting social scientists and other experts at the table, or are there areas where we need more knowledge? What would be your view on that?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, we all, you know, there's this long history of socio-technical systems theory, and many scholars have done great work to try to embed those principles of socio-technical systems, which is really about just bringing the human in early into these, like we've been talking about. And some of the challenges have been around how do you do that in a practical way. It's particularly challenging when it's a new system. I think if it's and often, of course, because of the technology, it changes everything. It almost is a new system. So, you know, that example I gave before of the submarines, one of the big challenges is, you know, we're trying to create work and design work and figure it out when there are so many unknowns in the future. So it's absolutely challenging. And I think, you know, part of it is about us creating tools, processes, testing them out. That's part of it. And there's been some work in that area. People like Goodell's Compass is a good example. But I actually also think we have to go deeper than that. And I'm really interested in more trying to influence the mindsets of the designers and commissioners of technology. So I think, you know, we even need to be looking at the education of people, you know, to create broader education bases of our engineers, for example. So that they've got language around this stuff. Because the problem with the tool sort of thing, you know, when you've got a tool of, you know, I think it can become very compliant and very tick box. You know, let's tick this box. Yeah, we've talked about demands, you know, but what we really want people to actually understand what it is that's important. And I think that might come from some more deeper education, perhaps, of people who create and implement and commission technology. So that's, I don't know, but what do you think, Curtin? I'm interested to hear any thoughts you have.
It was really just an open question, but I think it sounds reasonable. One thing is really the mindset, or just maybe even starting in educating engineers and making them aware of the role of humans in technological systems.
And I think there's
sounds like a reasonable approach, yeah.
I think that's part of it. And then also there's these much bigger challenges around, you know, managerialism, you know, and sort of short-term KPIs that chief executives have, you know, all of these sorts of other forces. And this goes back to that question of antecedents of work design, you know, one being technology, but another being sort of payment systems. But, you know, there's also things like the very short-term perspective of the senior leaders in many organizations, which means, you know, it's perhaps looks way better for their career to bring in some technology and say they've done all this amazing stuff, you know, than to sort of stretch it out and really think about the work and follow through on the long-term consequences of their decisions and so on. So I think there's a whole bunch of factors that probably need to come together. One of the papers that colleagues and I wrote is on antecedents of work design, where we talk about things that are, you know, maybe at the national level, you know, the regulations that exist around health and safety or technology or data privacy, these make a big difference. But also things at the organizational level, like the culture of the organization, the leadership, the sorts of things I just mentioned. Even locally, the team level can make a difference. Then of course, individuals can shape things too. So maybe that's one of the challenges. There's a lot of moving parts to this challenge that probably need to be considered.
It sounds a bit like 15 years ago when we tried to tell bankers or teach bankers about ethics because apparently they didn't know about ethics, and now we have to tell the tech people how to treat humans like humans or something like that. So I'm sorry, we are a bit over time already, and we still have the one-on-one talks. And but this is very good because this was a very enthusiastic discussion and or lively discussion. That was great. So I say thank you very much, Sharon. This was really an interesting talk, and we very much enjoyed it. And I can speak for the entire group, I believe. I hope we stay in contact. And now, first the two of us, and then Vera and Michelle will have the two-on-two talk, so we one-on-one talk, so we can just stay in the line. And so thank you from all of us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.